All right, well, today is May 18th, 2021. My name is Tom Paragi, and on behalf of the Alaska Chapter of the Wildlife Society, I'm very pleased to interview today Dr. John Trent for our Conserving Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage Program with the Wildlife Society. So, John, I'll start with the beginning. When and where were you born, and what things you remember about your early years that have may influenced your interest in nature?
Well, I was born May 15th, 1943, in Glendale, California. My dad was John Parkinson Trent, now deceased, and my mother was Marion Pike. Marion was from Worcester, Massachusetts, and Dad's family was from Southern California. We moved to Kodiak 3 years after I was born in 1946. Dad was in the Navy, and the family stayed there just about a year, went back to California, then came back to Alaska to stay in 1951. But I actually spent the rest of my childhood on Kodiak, graduated from Kodiak High in 1961. And what I remember about my kid years on, we called it the Rock, on Kodiak, is I got very interested in scouting. Started as a Cub Scout, and scouting was my whole life for 4 or 5 years anyway. I was one of the first Eagle Scouts on the island, and one of the things I was just desperate to get out and camp and do stuff outdoors, and that was the venue for me. Two things that were, one thing that was important was there were 2 merit badges. One was nature. You have to earn these badges and jump through hoops and stuff. And the other was wildlife management. I got a merit badge in wildlife management. And there was a picture of rising geese on the cover of this manual. Must have been at Horicon Marsh. And that was about the time that I decided that I wanted to be a wildlife biologist if I ever could be. And it's actually the only thing I've ever wanted to be for the rest of my life.
Well, that's really nice. In that period of time when you were 10, 12 years old or so, were there any particular books that you read or events that you participated in or people that started to influence you at that time to help nurture some of this interest in nature and the outdoors?
No one specific. I did have a very early mentor. He was the scoutmaster or on the committee there, and his name was Mr. Brickle. But other than that, no one really comes to mind. I've always been kind of a loner, and at that point in time, when you're really young, I was just outside doing stuff and pretty much on my own.
Okay. Were you doing hunting and fishing and things like that? Were typical of that era?
A neighbor taught me how to hunt. We were actually hunting snowshoe hares, which were introduced, by the way, on the island, and we used the Beagle, which was fun. So and then we'd drive our bicycles around the runway. We had a shortcut. We'd go under the culvert under the Kodiak runway to get to the fish, and then you'd strap a silver salmon onto your handlebars and come home. So we did stuff like that. And in Scouts, I liked to use the canoes, and we'd occasionally sneak them out and run them in the surf and stuff like that. Just kind of normal kid stuff, yeah.
Okay. So after you graduated from high school in 1961, did you go right into college at that point?
I did 2 things. I immediately started working for the Department of Fish and Game as a summer employee. Actually started in Christmas break in 1960, which was just about the time the department was beginning. So one part of my story here today is that I've basically been a fly on the wall for the Department of Fish and Game from 1961, my first summer season, till the time I retired in 2004. And I guess my story is I never really did anything unusual or spectacular, but I watched a lot of things happen and a lot of personalities come and go, and of course developed a real fondness for first the division of game, and then Dick Bishop converted the name to, or it was his idea anyway, to wildlife conservation. So that really is it's always been my professional family. And anyway, I was a fly on the wall.
So those early summer jobs when you're in college, were they on Kodiak? Were they in different parts of the state?
I actually had 9 field seasons altogether before I was hired permanent in 1969. The first 2, I don't know if you want the details, but the first summer I was a laborer at Katoy Bay Research Station, fisheries station, that on a fognack.
Fognack,
On
okay.
a fognack, and it later got washed out to sea in the tsunami, in the 1964 earthquake. But it's been replaced. Fisheries research primarily. I was there 2 summers, and then in you want the details, or do you just?
I think it's an interest, yeah.
Or just want to know that I was a temporary. Well, in 1963, I started working in what was called the bug house at the university, because I started university that very fall from high school in 61, and I got a part-time job in the place called the bug house, which is where we preserved or prepared specimens. We used hermisted beetles, we boiled things up, typical kind of wildlife stuff to do. And so that was in 63, and then midsummer I went up to Fort Yukon and worked with Cal Lensink on the waterfowl ground surveys. That was the time of the Rampart Dam project that Governor Greening was so keen to have, and we were counting ducks to actually correlate with aerial surveys. Anyway, 61, 63, I was on the Susitna River as a fisheries technician, and then later, there's a story, I don't know how many stories you want, but I started working for Sterling Idy. He was the area biologist at Kodiak, and one detail he sent me out, and this was in the fall, is he'd read an article in the Journal of Wildlife Management, which was probably a mistake, and read a design for spray painting animals. And so it was a 3/4 inch piece of pipe with a screw-in nipple, hole in the nipple, and a nail, and then a rat trap at 90 degrees. I promise not to take too many stories, but I've always liked this one. And then a shotgun shell inside the pipe, paint, and a cork, and then a fishing line across the bear trail. And I went out alone and was out there for a week or 10 days. Of course, the weather went down, didn't get out. But I actually had a marvelous time. And as best I can tell, I may have painted one bear. But this was in Terror Bay in Kodiak on the I guess you'd call it the west side. And it was a marvelous experience. Anyway, that was 64, 65, and 66. I was a technician for Bob Whedon at Eagle Summit on the Steves Highway. It was a 10-year ptarmigan population project, and pretty much became a member of the family at that time. We did a lot of stuff together. 65, 66, then 67, 68, I was a ranger naturalist in what was then called McKinley National Park. 68 to 69, I worked for a forestry department in southern Germany. Came back in the summer of 69 and Bud Burris put me on a lynx research project at Central Alaska and then also on the Porcupine River. So at the end of all of that, I had a pretty solid technician's view of what was going on in the field, at least in some small parts of Alaska. That's the long answer.
Yeah. At your career at UAF, were there any particular classes that were really of interest to you? I know you have a strong interest in botany. Did that develop when you were at UAF?
Yes, and there was a casualty there. I took several courses in taxonomic botany, and that's where I met my wife. We were supposed to be keying out plants, and I'm highly distractible, and next thing I know, I've been married for 53 years to the same woman. So, botany, I actually at Eagle Creek, it's in the collections at the University in Fairbanks, flora of Eagle Creek. Not huge, but at least some sampling of the vascular plants that we saw. We would walk as much as 15 miles a day catching ptarmigan and doing some other recordings. So, that was one class that I liked. I enjoyed ornithology from Bryna Kessel. I thought she was an outstanding teacher and have always had very high regard for her. And L. Gerard Schwartz taught parasitology, and several of us we just had a marvelous time in there. And so those are some classes that I particularly enjoyed.
Nate, when you went to Germany, was that part of an exchange program or a study abroad, or was that simply like a summer internship?
It was neither. I just went over there to meet Gerda's parents, and a family friend was the forester in this particular city, and so I got a job feeding roe deer and cutting Christmas trees. But it was a time, and there were a couple of hunts there, both for roe deer and for European hares. But it was a chance to kind of see the German management system, which I was very interested in, from the bottom up. Nothing official, but I just had this shiny new wildlife management degree, which impressed me at the time, and it was interesting to see a very different system. So that's what I did.
So in that system, John, are the foresters also somewhat the game managers or habitat managers?
Yes, they basically do everything. Any wildlife research there is done out of the universities, and I was never able to get into that. It would have been nice. I know some of Dave Klein's students were over there. Detlef Eisfeld was there. I don't know if you remember that name. But I never had any contact with them. So the forester was in charge of, in this case, it was a city forester. The forest was in the city. I took a bus to work every day. It was a little bit different. And the way they do things over there is hunting is basically leased out by either the city or the state to individuals. It's called a hunting revier, and those are the hunting rights, but they're on farmland. They're on privately owned land. So the hunter has a responsibility, for example, to reimburse the hunter for crop damage. But we were doing things like feeding deer, occasionally culling deer, that kind of thing. And it was a highly managed silviculture system. You may remember Gifford Pinchot's days. He brought a lot of these ideas over back at the end of the 19th century. So it was a chance to see a system quite different from ours, actually a genesis of our system that we have now, a reaction to it, privately owned. That's something we make a big deal out of. But what impressed me is a member of the family was a It's the right word, avid. He was a passionate hunter. And this was a guy who was not wealthy, didn't own a revere, but he was part of a family that was involved. Relation was the forester, and he was a very active hunter, and so that's an impression that we've had from over in this country, that only rich people can hunt in Germany. That's probably true to a considerable extent, but anybody who really wants to and can pass the hunter exam there, the Jagdprüfung, can do it. But you do need connections. But if you really want to hunt, you can hunt.
Yeah. Well, that's a great experience for a young biologist to have that opportunity to see that. So in 1967, you started full-time employment with Fish and Game after you finished college. What were some of the things as a full-time employee that you got into with Fish and Game? And this was working out of the Fairbanks office, is that right?
That's correct, and it was actually in the fall of 1969.
Okay.
And I was hired as basically a beginning biologist, and I was a management biologist, have been a management biologist my whole career, really, not a research person. But I also, and Bud Burris, by the way, made the hire. Bob Hinman was the regional supervisor at that time. And they were very community-oriented. They were, I would say, excellent managers who had good contact with the community, both of them, but especially Bud. And so part of my charge or brief was public relations. In those days, we called it I&E. The names change as the time goes on and people get older. But so that was something that I was supposed to be doing. In Fairbanks, I took an anthropology course and a couple of journalism courses, so I had sort of a basic introduction to some of those things. And basically, Burris just turned me loose. So some days I'd help run a check station, count moose with somebody, do stuff around the office. But on other days, quite a lot of the time, I was doing what you now call these days outreach stuff. And I was just like a kid in a candy store. I mean, I was all over the place like Chicken Man. I had a TV program that I did on a weekly basis, a writing column in the newspaper. I teamed up with a journalist at the News Miner, and I think I did some radio stuff, and then also, and this was a main source of contact with the public, I attended the Tanana Valley Sportsmen's Association. So I have to emphasize, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was doing a lot of stuff, and I think that work actually set the tone for what you're still doing in that office today with outreach. It's a very close relationship with the Fairbanks community in central Alaska. Fish and Game is an important part of the community there, and I think that's a good thing.
So were you the first person to have a job that, in a sense, that really had a strong focus on outreach? Before then, was it more catch as catch can, whereas you were kind of given the latitude to pursue this a little more broadly and than other people had before you?
Yes, I was the first person, I think, who really had this as a job. And after me came Dave Johnson. He replaced me when I went to graduate school. And then I think after Dave was Kathy Harms, who was there for many years, and of course you knew very well, or know very well.
And I recall that reading in one of the old Wildlife Society newsletters that they mentioned you had created and taught a class on wildlife management at Lathrop High School around 1974.
That sounds about right. So I think it was only for 2 semesters, 2 years at the most. I was clubbed up with a very active high school athletics coach named Jim Wisenhant, who started Beaver Sports at about the same time. And it was an interesting experience. What I learned from a lot of these activities, especially with the teaching, is that was too much of a reach for a wildlife biologist. Teaching is a difficult profession that requires a certain kind of person. Discipline in the classroom is important. So at the end, and that was probably why it was only a year, I felt like the best way to deal with that would be to develop a teaching plan, a lesson plan that teachers could use. And that's kind of a full-time job. So, and I think that the school liked it, the kids mostly liked it, but I don't think I really should have been there, you know. But so that's what I was doing, as I was checking things out and developing some skills along the way and trying to do the best I could for the department. One thing that's always been important in the department is advisory committees, and in Fairbanks, the Tanana Valley Sportsmen's Association. And one of the things I got out of that first 5 years, and by the way, we have a lot longer to go, just keep that in mind, but we got yelled at a lot at the Tanana Valley Sportsmen's Association. This was really the middle of the cow-moose wars. And I got the impression as those 5 years went on that something wasn't working right. The assumption of how we communicated with the public and how they communicated back, I mean, it just wasn't working. I was getting tired of getting yelled at, but I like these people. And they're great people, all of them. I mean, wonderful personalities. But the communication process, it puzzled me, but it's also clear to me that some things were going wrong. I mean, you shouldn't have to work with the public and have that anger, for example. And so yeah.
Could you give just a brief encapsulation for folks? What is the Cow-Moose Wars? This was in the early 1970s.
Right, and what basically occurred there, it was especially strong in the Mat-Su Valley, but also around Fairbanks. Is over the years, biologists had learned that with bull-only seasons, male-only seasons, you systematically removed the males from the population, and pretty much, or to a large extent, you had only females. And when you're having a bull-only season, that means reduced opportunity. And you can get down to the point where the bull-cow ratio actually becomes a reproductive problem. I think that was more theory than fact, but so biologists, both research and management biologists, were trying to explain this to the public. And what was really going on is that, and these were mostly hunters, and they had grown up with this idea that you only shot bulls and the cows were the producers. And so this idea was new and actually not acceptable to many of them. And what we know now, or what I think I know now, is what was going on there were some education issues, but mostly issues about how the human mind works concerning values, opinions, and attitudes. And that's, I finally said, well, I don't know what's going on here. The biology is good, but, and this is the term that's used often, is we were trying to use a silver bullet. We were saying, here's the information, bang, okay, now you're educated. Well, as you know, nah. So after 5 years, I was getting frustrated, and I think I was irritating my peers as well. So, and the pipeline came along, so I I quit, and actually at the same time, Dick Bishop, who was in the office as a research biologist, he had completed his master's on seals. He went to McGrath, and I went to Madison, Wisconsin. And so we left at the same time, and I think we both got a jade mousetrap from our colleagues. And I remember the party was at TVSA. So that's kind of that story.
So going to Madison, what attracted you to Madison?
Well,
Graduate school, obviously.
yeah, I was interested in communications issues. And first of all, Aldo Leopold started the profession there. And that always impressed me. And I thought, well, I can't really go wrong going to the place where our profession began. But the thing that actually really focused my attention was about that time in the early 70s, the Wildlife Society and others were starting to talk more about wildlife outreach and education. And the term that was used, the genesis of this whole idea, was human dimensions. So about 1975, this little brown book showed up in the office, and it's called, I don't know if you can see it, but it's called Human Dimensions in Wildlife Programs. And that thing just kind of hit me like a bullet. I read it carefully. I got excited. The authors are John Hendy and Clay Shainfeld. Clay was a professor at Madison, and I wrote him to see if I could go, and packed up the family in the family Volvo, stuffed a bunch of stuff in a trailer with no springs, and headed off for Madison, where I was for 8 years, by the way, seeking truth and not necessarily finding it.
So you got a couple different degrees there, is that right? A couple different subject areas?
It was all generally in the same area. I was in the Department of Agricultural Journalism, but actually for both degrees. But my master's degree was a study of communication process up and down through a wildlife management agency there, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He had just reorganized and put everybody in one shop. And so I was looking at communications between the different divisions, and especially between the department and its publics, especially farmers and hunters. So actually a very aggressive approach. I didn't know any better, and nobody else did either. So it took me quite a long time to get that done.
And it's predominantly private lands back in Wisconsin compared to Alaska. There's some public lands, but it's largely farmlands, forests, etc.
That's correct. There are national forests and other types of public lands. There's plenty of hunting opportunity there, and deer populations at that time were nowhere near what they are now. We didn't have I'm sorry.
They were much lower then?
Yes, and they were still adequate. And one of the things that we did, particularly in my PhD program, was I was working for a professor of social psychology and sociology mostly, and we were doing crowding studies. So we had this fenced-in area in central Wisconsin, and we would see how many hunters we could push in there. And there was a pheasant hunting area at an old Air Force base near Milwaukee. And then we would study, or the dependent variable was satisfaction. What happens to satisfaction when you increase density, hunter density?
So you were interviewing some of these hunters before and then after your treatment experiment?
Yeah, sir, and also paper surveys at that time. Questionnaires, we did a lot of survey process, personal interviews, and then for the PhD, I used the mail questionnaires for statewide deer and goose hunters. But so there was a strong recreational kind of a social psychology dimension to much of what I did there. And to answer the question, what happens when you increase density, satisfaction goes up. It doesn't go down. And there's probably an inflection point there, but we were never able to do it. But what the hunters liked when we put more hunters in there is they moved the deer around, so they got more opportunity to see deer, which is very important in that equation, and to get some opportunities to shoot. And there's a certain type of hunter who very much likes that kind of opportunity. Same thing at this pheasant hunting area. People would almost follow the release truck around. And it was a perfectly valid experience for people who enjoyed doing that. So anyway, I was mucking around in this stuff, and I'd been there so long for the master's degree that we just decided to go for broke and do the PhD. And when I left Madison in 1982, Cody hired me to be the area biologist at what was then called Barrow. And I was desperate to get out of, here's another little story, desperate to get out of the graduate school. I'd been there way too long, And I was up in the attic of the dean, the college dean, as old building. And as I was up there tippy-tapping on a typewriter, mind you, because word processors were just coming in, and I had a map of Alaska up there, and I could see a place on the Colville River where there was the Killick Bend, and I kept saying to myself, I got to get out of this place, which was a song at the time in Vietnam. And so, Cody hired me, and we left, and I was what was called ABD. I didn't have this dissertation done. It was pretty well drafted. But once I got to being an area biologist, it took me some years to finish it. There's a 5-year limit, and I got in under the wire. And that was a study of essentially how hunters may perceive hunting quality, which is a more broader term and more difficult term to decide than satisfaction. So, that's that story.
So going to Barrow, then that's quite a transition culturally and in terms of the work there. Were you doing some things in Barrow, some new experiences there, exposure to marine mammals, exposure to the Northern Ocean? What were some interesting experiences you had as the biologist up in Barrow?
Well, of course, it was a very different environment from the Midwest. And I'd been, let me make sure I can say this. No, I had not been in the Arctic before. And brings me to mind of another subject I'd like to touch on, and that's accidents and mortalities in the division. But coming to Barrow, I'm sorry, I have to back up. When I was in those first 5 years, I was hired in 1969. In 1969, a friend of mine who was in the same office and is Rex Thomas and Peter Winslow disappeared on the North Slope out of Prudhoe Bay. And we went up and looked for them. That was actually my first exposure to the Arctic. So I misspoke. That was in 1969. I believe it was in 1972 that Jim Erickson, who was the sheep research biologist at Fairbanks at the time, with a Fish and Wildlife Service pilot who I didn't know were killed on the upper Hula Hula River on the North Slope. Those were, for me, brand new biologists, just starting to work, just starting to figure out what's going on. Those were devastating experiences. When we heard for sure that Erickson was missing, I remember Hinman slamming his hand down on the desk, and there was an exclamation, and anger and sorrow and frustration. And then the next thing I knew, there was this line of aircraft landing out at the airport that were coming up for the search, at least 3 of them. Fish and Wildlife Service, of course. So that was kind of my introduction, in a way, to the fact that there's risk involved with what we do in our profession. And it wasn't the last time. In fact, my family's had a history of some mortalities as well. But it continued. In 1995, we lost Randy Zarnke at Bethel. And
Randy Cajun.
I'm sorry. Not Randy Zarnke. Randy Cajun. Yeah, on a moose count. And I think as more recently in 2014, in the Fish and Wildlife Service, where I was working at the time, the senior pilot for an aircraft that we use was also killed along with the crew in that airplane in Cook Inlet. So mortalities or serious accidents, fortunately, there's very few of them now. But it's part of what you do, and you have to be very careful. And at the beginning, for a young biologist, it was a lesson that was never forgotten.
Yeah, because being up in Barrow, you were probably in aircraft for some of your work because it's such a vast area.
Oh yeah, and you asked me about what was going on in Barrow. I worked on caribou, moose, and bears primarily, mostly survey and inventory work. How many do we have? That kind of thing. And I was the 3rd biologist in Barrow, so I wasn't actually maybe the 4th, because Lentfer was first, and then there was Harry Reynolds, and Sam Patton. No, not Sam Patton. Who was he ran the
Herb Melchior?
Yeah, Herb Melchior was the one who preceded me.
Right.
But a major issue in Barrow, and really really all of rural Alaska, indigenous Alaska, was what we later called this landscape of public resistance. This was a fundamental issue that we were wrestling with through the 80s, 90s, and even to some degree in the 10s. And and that was what I was basically trained to do from the graduate work. And so when I went to Barrow, I was there as a biologist, and I very much enjoyed doing that work. But I was really interested in trying to find a way to avoid the problems that I'd encountered. And they were far more difficult issues because they were about 2 different cultures. And you probably remember the story of the Barrow Duck-In, which occurred in 1962. That was an act of public disobedience that was actually a critical act for the indigenous people of Alaska, especially on the North Slope. So I wanted to do something that was important for me. I think it was important for the department, and certainly that's the reason John Cody hired me for that position. And so when I went up there, I intentionally used a model that I learned from Cooperative Extension Service. And that is, it wasn't an enforcement model, and that's what people were used to. I come up there, I was the game warden, all right? But no, I'm here because you're interested in wildlife. You depend on wildlife, and not just interest. Your lives depended on these animals. And I think I have something to offer that we can do together. And you noticed I didn't say that I'm here from the government to help you. Didn't say that. And so the cooperative extension model was an important one, and that was a good place to start. And the other concept, by the way, and I see you looking at the clock or something, but the other concept was the concept of socialization. And that, I haven't talked about values and attitudes, there's no time for it, but the way you solve problems with people that are different is you get to know them and they get to know you. And you develop a sense of rapport and personal respect. And then you can do things. And that takes time. And I think one of the strengths of the Department of Fish and Game system is these rural area biologist positions scattered around the state, because that's exactly what happens. And there are many, many fine management biologists who've done the same thing. I just happen to do it in Barrow.
No, that's a good thing to mention. I'm not checking the clock. What I'm checking is my notes. I'm kind of going through the chronology of your career and stuff. So that's good. I think you've done a very good job to characterize Barrow, not only the biological work, but the social and cultural context, which is really important. And that's kind of how I know you and know of you, is that type of work you were doing. It was, to me, a degree greater than the average person did. So that's really kind of what I looked up to you as kind of embodying that. Now, from Barrow, you were up there about 6 years, and then your next job was down to Anchorage. Is that correct?
My wife actually had something to do with that. After 5 years, she said, "I'm leaving. You can come if you want to." I said, "Okay, I'll come." I would have.
Other biologists have had that ultimatum.
Oh yes, and I would have preferred to stay there longer, because we were actually. It was a great place for our family, and I have to say this: people on the North Slope, every place I went to, they were gracious. There was wonderful hospitality. We were treated very well. And we were also part of the community. My wife was a nurse. Our kids were in school. And so it was a good experience for everybody, actually. And we were sorry to leave. And we still have friends there. I mean, good friends. And Geoff Carroll took the job after me, and he did an even better job, you know. I mean, and he was there much longer. He's married in, and he just, he was a marvelous area biologist. So anyway, I got a position in Anchorage as a management coordinator. At that time, we had split coordinators. So I had the responsibility for the coastal area biologists, which included Cordova, by the way. This was 1988, and you can guess what happened in 1989. That's when the Exxon Valdez fetched up on the reef outside of Valdez, and Bly Reef, actually. And I called up Herman Grisset and said, it was in the morning, I said, "Guess what? You got a ship out there that's leaking hundreds of thousands of gallons of, or whatever it was, tens of thousands of gallons of oil." And and Lou Pamplin was the director at that time. And anyway, management coordinator in Anchorage. Turns out I wasn't very good at that. And if I have time to talk about careers, I'd like to do that, some advice for young biologists. But
feel free. This is a good time to bring that up later. Oh.
Well, I came from Barrow, where things had gone very well, and we all had a good time, and always pretty popular in the division. It turns out I didn't really know the area or the staff well enough to be a good management coordinator in Anchorage. And Anchorage is quite a different place than Barrow or Nome, where our headquarters was, or Fairbanks even, as you well know. And they're great people in Anchorage, and I've got a lot of friends there. But as a management coordinator, I wasn't at the top of the list. So after several years, Dave Kellyhouse, Machine Gun Kellyhouse, had figured this out along with some other people, and they rolled a position for me, home rolled a position for me as the rural management coordinator for the state. There's another one of these deals where I had kind of an open brief, go out there, don't kill yourself, try to do some good. And that's what I did for the remainder of my time from 1988 to 2004 when I retired from the department. And there were several things that happened there that were good things.
Yeah. Why don't you describe some of the things? I know, for example, the Western Arctic Herd Working Group was something that I really associated your strong involvement with.
Yeah, I would say that was probably in terms of legacies, the thing that most people remember, and I do as well. It was an attempt. Co-management was another buzzword that was zipping around at that time, and the indigenous community was also interested in this because it's just too much to talk about, but they wanted control of the wildlife resources where they lived. And they really wanted to acquire the management authority. Well, that just wasn't possible unless the legislature and maybe even the Congress changed things. So a discussion of co-management required kind of sorting things out to, well, how can we do this where we can make decisions together, but the authority still rests with the appointed agencies. And that wasn't necessarily easy to do, but by meeting, and the idea here was to get all the actors together. And the Western Arctic herd covers quite a bit of ground. And so we started meeting in different places, especially Nome, Kotzebue, Anchorage. We even went to Anaktuvuk Pass one time. And out of that, right around the turn of the century, we organized the Western Arctic Caribou Working Group. The agencies played a strong role as equals. The department, the BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. And that organization is, and we were encouraged, by the way, by the Board of Game. They said, okay, you figure out what to do, and we'll take it from there. And it's still working. And I think that's a model of what you can do if you have the energy and the time, and people have something that they all want to give and they all want to get. And that's what you have to do. There's no shortcuts. But I have still friends there, and I think they're doing a wonderful job.
What were some other projects that you worked on? Because this was a statewide job, right, in terms of the rural.
Right.
So did you work at all in Southeast or parts of the interior? Or?
Not so much in Southeastern. Now, I still had kind of a Bering Sea and Beaufort Sea focus, but anytime, and attended a lot of meetings. So AFN for sure, and one of the first things I did, and I think it was 93 or so, is there was a man named Matthew Aya from Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, who had been very active as a leader in wildlife resource issues, really throughout the state. He was very visible. He died about that time, or a year or two earlier. So what I did, I thought it would be nice to have a memorial to him in Nome. So I actually organized a brass, it wasn't a statue, but a plaque that Skip Wallen made for us down in Juneau, and that's still there in Nome today. It's right on the main street next to the visitor center. And I like that project. It took a fair amount of effort, but it said, okay, we recognize what this person did. It was important, and so that kind of reflected the importance to the indigenous community. I remember several people came in for Savunga for the dedication ceremony. And so that's kind of how I got started. Another thing I did, which took quite a bit of effort in kind of the mid-90s, was I've always been interested in harvest assessment. How many are we actually taking out of the population? And that's kind of still a kind of a black box. There's been a number of changes, but also with social media, it's gotten a lot more complicated, and cell phones. But I organized a international harvest assessment symposium at Girdwood. And the only people we didn't really get were Russians. We didn't know how to invite them, and the indigenous community was well represented there. And that was kind of the beginning of working together, where there was a sense that people wanted to do this. And so those are some of the things that I did. There was also, the Walrus Commission I mostly did as a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist later on.
Okay. So it sounds like the graduate's experience you had in terms of communication really was beneficial when you came back to Fish and Game. You had these tools and these experiences and perspectives, and you were able to put them to use in your career. And this thing that was this human dimensions that was relatively new in the 1970s, it sounds like you were really able to use your graduate training effectively in your jobs.
That might be going too far. I spent a lot of time at Madison, had a wonderful experience there. I learned a lot of different things. I think at the end of that, and especially now at the end of my career, I've sort of put together a model that I think that I understand how resource agencies interact with their publics, which is what the question was when I left after 5 years in Fairbanks. It's not a solid answer, and it's complicated, but I did have some tools when I came back. I also had a lot of stuff that, a lot of arrows for my bow I didn't use, or I wasn't sure how to use them, that kind of thing. I studied social organization in Madison, to look at how resource agencies are structured, political decision-making, all of those things. So it was kind of a handful of spaghetti or something. But it was helpful. I think if I had to do it again, that rural issues coordinator should have been at a higher level in Juneau. More like information outreach departments are organized now, so there would be direct contact with director and commissioner and more of an organized approach. But yeah, I did, I came back. I went out there trying to seek truth. I'm not even sure there is such a thing as truth, but I came back with some good ideas and a lot of support and things I learned from my friends at the University of Wisconsin.
I mean, is there anything that you can offer up in terms of some of your insights on how agencies can be effective in reaching out to the public, especially across cultural divides like that? You've talked some about it. Is there anything else that you can offer up on that in perspective?
I think it helps to have some appreciation for how the whole process works. Communication, which is what I've always done and been fairly good at, is only part of the environment that agencies have in society. You can have all the communication in the world, but if two different agencies are head to head, or you have alienated some parts of the legislature, stuff isn't going to get done. And so you need to know how all of it works together. And I cut to the chase here and say what I think is important for success in resource management in Alaska, especially in wildlife management, is you have to have good science. If you have flaws in your science, you're going to have some real problems down the road. I can give examples. And you have to have good public process. You got to treat people with respect. You have to understand the communication systems. And you have to have both of those things. And then I think, to go along with that, you have to enjoy and take seriously being a public steward. You have to be a public servant. You have to like that. You're not never going to make much money out of it, but I've always really enjoyed that. And enjoyed working with all these wonderful people over the years. So you need that sense of respect and interest as serving the public. And here's one last thing to put into the blender. You need to have humility. I mean, if you think you know everything that a wolverine does, let alone what a wolverine or caribou population does, you're just kidding yourself. And we've learned more, but there's more to learn. And we have a very fine department of, all the agencies have strengths and some excellent people in all of them, including ours. Our specialty in Fish and Game is wildlife population management. And we do a good job of that. Anyway, there's more to it. But yeah, good science, good public process, public service, stewardship, really. And, you know, this is kind of almost a lecture, but when I was learning that first part all the way through my career in Fish and Game, we all remember that section from Title 16. Duties of the Commissioner, that section, to preserve, protect, maintain, and improve the fish and wildlife and grassland resources with beneficial uses to users. Now, that's not an exact quote, but it's pretty close. And so that's what we called it, protecting the resource, managing the resource. And the only thing you got to keep in mind with that is what a resource is. A resource is something in nature, caribou herd, caribou, mosquito, whatever it is, to which we humans have attached value. If there's no value to it, it's not a resource. It's something we're not interested in. Gravel around Anchorage is an important resource because people build with it. So I never really understood that until fairly late in my professional life. And you have to keep that in mind because a resource to you isn't a resource to me. And it's a human construct.
Right. Well, there's a lot of things you learned in your period with the Department of Fish and Game, more than 40 years, but you didn't rest on your laurels at that point. You turned around and then worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for another several years on marine mammals. How did your Fish and Game experience prepare you for that? And what were some of the new challenges of working? It's a different agency, and dealing with marine mammals is a different legal construct and, for management there. What were some of the ins and outs of that different job?
It was a different job. I took the job because I felt it was time to leave the department, but I just can't stay away from what we do. And I've always had a lot of admiration for the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular. I think they are par excellence wildfowl, waterfowl managers in particular, and the National Refuge System is, I think, frankly, without peer anywhere in the world. And so I've always kind of looked up to them, and I thought it would be fun to work with them. And I was hired as management of walrus management in the state. And it's a very different organization. It's a national organization. So there's a lot of people cycling through. There's the same focus, at least in marine mammals management where I was not so much on research. That was done by the Geological Survey. And they actually moved out of the building about the time I came. And I've always been a big fan of doing things together. And so learning things about polar bears, which you really needed to learn if you're going to do anything with them, that was over down the street in Geological Survey. And that made it hard because we were no longer handling the animals so much. We were doing the management and, to some degree, the political work. And what did happen at that time, and I didn't have anything to do with it, but it was a triumph for our Office of Marine Mammals Management, was Rosa Meehan, who was the lead there, and a biologist named Scott Schleby were successful and spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and they got all polar bear populations in the world declared as threatened. And that was a huge thing. I mean, you may not like it, or, and in fact, the number of people who hate it, but it was a significant step in terms of managing these populations and giving us the leverage to take care of it. Anyway, what was different in Fish and Wildlife Service, still went to a lot of meetings. And then that position, walrus program, I moved over to something called marking, tagging, and reporting. I've always been interested in harvest assessment, as I've said. So in that case, we have a system of people all around the coast who accounted for the harvest, tagging polar bears. I mean, I started my career pulling polar bear teeth out at Point Hope, and I ended my career pulling teeth out of sea otters in the lab in Anchorage. So I guess in that respect, I never got very far. But it was a lot of fun. Then that job, that was my last job with the service, because I was responsible for the support and maintenance of all these taggers. 50, 60, 70, whatever they were in all these communities. So you had to go to the community, see how things were doing, find a new tagger, visit with them. I mean, the fellow who carved this bolo tie was one of the taggers. And it was a good way to get know people in a lot of different communities. And
probably a good way to stay in touch with people as well, because you've had some of these long-term relationships with people in some of these communities.
Yeah. And so those are some of the things. But Fish and Wildlife Service is certainly a very different agency. There is a concept there I'd like to touch on briefly, and that is, after ANILCA in 1980, the federal government became a much more visible and active presence in resource management in Alaska. And it was a difficult thing for some people in the Department of Fish and Game, frankly, to deal with. And there's still some anger and bitterness there. And I've always taken the point of view, since I was always a ground troop down on the bottom and didn't have to deal with the politics, I always have taken the perspective that it's a good thing to have these different administrative systems is what they are, because it's more talent, more resources for taking care of the resource. Might be a different, set of mandates, might be different public. I mean, the national agencies have publics in the states. We don't up here. That's an issue. But I've always thought that, and I've met in nearly all these agencies, I haven't worked with the Forest Service much, really good people who want to work together. And I just think that has really been a major step for me in the right direction. And not everybody agrees with that. And there's certainly been a lot of pain and heartburn and border issues. Some people try to move in this direction or that direction. We talked about the cow-moose wars. Then there was the wolf predation issue, which maybe we shouldn't talk about. But a lot of agency angst there,
Right. This is a perfect venue to talk about this, John. Part of what we're trying to do is understand the history, and you lived through some of that history. I've only read it.
Well, me too. Wayne Reglan was deeply involved in that, and I haven't had a chance to see his COWCH interview yet, but I will. I've read his book, and that was and still is an issue in Alaska where people have different value systems, primarily about wolves and how they interact in the environment with especially with prey populations, and it's also an issue where biologists have had to change because we've learned more. And Sam Harbaugh in the COWCH interview talks about the time when he had this light bulb went off, and everyone was telling him up to that point in time, wolves don't have any impact on prey populations. It came from experiences in the state with low density populations. Well, guess what? They sure as hell do, and especially up here, and that's been a specialty in your office for quite some time. And then really a basis of the whole intensive management effort beginning in the 90s is that wolves do have an impact on prey populations. The relationship is complex. And so that was a change that we had to make. That's why you need to have good biology, and you keep learning new stuff. And then maybe that's the best place to leave it, but there are people who are passionate about expanding the boundary of Denali Park to protect a particular pack of wolves. And there's another bunch of people, including most of the Board of Game, who aren't going to do that. This is part of resource management. And I think actually management is a term that I try not to use as much anymore, because that implies when you're managing something, like when you're managing a checkbook, that you mostly know what you're doing. Overdraft here and there maybe, or whatever. Well, I think that's almost an arrogant approach to understanding ecosystems, how they function, how they're vulnerable, and how you apply public stewardship to them. So I got Leopold's book, Sand County Almanac, on my bookshelf. I also have, I think it's called Game Management, 1930 or whatever, 33 maybe. And his concepts that he developed in that book a lot had to do with small game populations, bobwhite quail and some other things. And it was a great place to start. But I think his main contribution was the conservation ethic idea. And again, as a sort of junior social psychologist or whatever it is, I would say that conservation ethic is still human-oriented. It's a social concept. It's an important one, but it's not everything, and it has a particular point of view. And anyway, another lecture. I should probably stop, but it's just been a pleasure for me, sometimes a challenge, to work in this area, in this really great place where we have a chance still to do it right. And I'll end with, or if you're ready to end, I am. Maybe you have some more questions. But here's another, what I think is fundamental concept that it's important to recognize, and that is in resource management, in renewable resource management, in wildlife management in particular, the wagons are circled. We're fighting an overwhelming influence to develop the state of Alaska. Development is what every politician, elected politician, wants to do. Well, guess what? That's not good for wildlife. And I think it's remarkable that over these 50 years I've been noodling about our profession, that we still have all of the major populations that I can think of, at least in large vertebrates, and I think even the so-called small game, we've done remarkably well. The only caribou population that I know of that is no longer extant, and caribou move around and populations come and go, but that's the Kilbuck Mountains herd down by Bethel. We had a management plan for them one time, and it's no longer necessary to have it. But it's remarkable. We have moose in Anchorage. We have brown bears living in Anchorage. We have viable populations, which is even more important. So we must be doing something right. But until and I think the Wildlife Society has a role to play here. We need to do a better job of communicating with political leadership that the road to more development, more growth, is not the right way to go. And I think the global warming issue and even the COVID pandemics point to that. Continued growth is not the way we're going to have the Alaska that we enjoyed for our great-grandchildren. It's not going to work. And I've seen it happen. And so we need to find a better way of working with these people who are making decisions, and more importantly, convincing people who vote that there's a better way to do things. We have to articulate that. And we can't just let the chambers of commerce say, we need to develop this, and oh, by the way, we're going to do it in a responsible manner. Well, what's a responsible manner? Is that putting a diaper underneath a leaking oil in a dump truck? Is that what it is? And anyway, I think that's a fundamental issue that we need to be aware of. We can do the very best work in the world as scientists in terms of public process to a certain degree, but until that gets turned around, we're on a downhill road eventually. Enough said.
Well, John, you had a remarkable career from 1961 to 2012 when you were an agency employee or professional, graduate trained 51 years. What would you like to leave people through with thinking about some of the futures of this changing profession in the society? You've talked about some of the challenges we have now. You mentioned earlier things about gender issues in the profession, or what are the things, what advice do you have for the younger folks starting the profession now, kind of what you learned, what's your perspective on what should they be looking for in terms of how to move into the future with the work they do, how they approach interacting with society? You brought up a very good point that good science, a good public process, but we have to have somehow this conservation or land ethic that Leopold called it. What thoughts do you have about what young folks should be thinking about in the profession? You specifically mentioned the gender issue earlier.
Well, there's two. I'm not sure how closely related they are to your question, but there's two things I wanted to talk about briefly. and that is, as the fly on the wall in the department over the decades, I've seen a substantial improvement in gender equity in our department. I started out, again, one of these experiences that sticks with you. When I was hired as a technician in one place, I replaced a woman who had been selected for the job because she was a woman. The wife of the biologist involved wasn't going to allow it. And this was a very capable person who went on to live a good and happy life, but not as a biologist. We lost her. And I know, at least from indirect experience, the early women in our division were pioneers, and some of them still are. And in the university system, I think of Bonita Neeland and Bryna Kessel. And those people had to come up through the ranks that were all male. And a lot of that is indirect or subtle resistance. There was a biologist in the Fairbanks office, female biologist, who I think suffered particularly, and I have regrets even that I didn't do more or didn't do anything about it. But that's changed to a considerable degree. We have more women in the profession. They are, in my view, excellent biologists. Some of them are outstanding, and we need more of that. And I know for women it's not over yet, and I don't want to outstep my gender perspective here, but what I'm trying to say is it's better, and the profession has improved because of it. And it's not just gender, it's also about different cultures. We've always tried, at least since I've been around, to recruit indigenous people into our profession. We haven't been very successful about it. Federal agencies have done, I think, a better job, but we now have a few people who are really outstanding. I probably won't mention the names, but they're slowly coming in. I think there's also a role for expanded technicians, and some of them have done that as well. So that's one thing is I think it's important to recognize that this is important and we need to keep working on it. My last supervisor was female, and that's good. You know, it's not good or bad. That's a better biologist than I was, better administrator for sure, and probably a better job done for the Fish and Wildlife Service at that time. So maybe I've said enough there. The other thing I wanted to suggest to biologists who are starting out is to have a concept of careers. When I started, I was just so happy to be a biologist. Retirement was, oh my God, that's when old people go to die or something. I never thought about it. Well, probably a useful way to think about a working career is over the term of 30 years. And by golly, 30 years went pretty fast for me. And I think in terms of a career where you start and you move your way through the system, there's going to be, and here's one thing I want to say, it's been my personal experience, I don't think it's unusual, there's going to be ups and downs. And you have to learn how to learn from those and move on, become better. Don't become bitter if you're in one of the slumps. Don't become arrogant if you're up on the top. It's not very likely that your career is going to go straight up. Maybe it will. Maybe it'll go straight down. Not likely. Maybe it'll stay flat. I always thought mine was kind of that way. But think in terms of you've got 30 years to do things. Things are going to change. Hopefully, you're going to grow, and then make plans to do something else when you're done. Because after 30 years, say you start when you're 30, you're going to be 60. You got at least another 10 or 20 years to do stuff. And so I recommend people to think about an encore career, a second career, related maybe to what you did first. And if money's important to you, which it is to most of us, you might want to figure out a way to get paid for it. So have a business ready, or there's many other things that you can do. John Sheen's career in Audubon Society after he left the department was outstanding. Significant contributions, and recently a book. So think about how you're going to go through this and what's going to happen next, because there's a next, okay? So that was really just the other thing that I wanted to mention, because I had to figure that out myself. And again, I think and here's where the Wildlife Society comes in. We are a unique platform for bringing together professionals from all walks of life. It's the only place, really, where we have a chance to exchange ideas and develop relationships. And that's crucial. And that's why I'm in the Wildlife Society. Haven't been as active as I would have liked, and that's why people should join. And I think we really need to reach out to try to because there's no other way to do this. So that's another comment that I would make.
Well, that's a very good ending comment, John, to bring this back. We're doing this COWCH interview for the Wildlife Society, especially for the benefit of our younger members, to see the rewards and challenges and how people have learned during their careers and you've done a lot of things after you've retired in terms of serving on boards. You've been a board member for the Wildlife Society in the Alaska chapter. So it's really good to capture some of this for the benefit of other people. And we're also breaking some new ground. This is the first COWCH interview done remotely. I'm here in Fairbanks. You're in Scott Jensen's studio in Anchorage. So we're constantly have to adapt to the new technology with it. So John, thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon to conduct this interview.
Well, thank you, Tom. And just remember, everybody, that it's a wonderful profession. Do the best you can. Treat everyone with respect. You'll have a wonderful time.